Sort of keying off of that, you title a chapter, More Money, More Problems. Why does more money sometimes cause more problems?
Well, again, I'm a millennial, and so I believe that's the wisdom of the great Christian theologian P. Diddy, who, as we found out over the last couple of years, is very much not a Christian or a theologian. But see, I'm going to get in trouble for all kinds of things. That'll be one of them. That will be an attack ad at some point in the future. But okay, so again, to set the stage here, I was a Christian and then I wasn't. And I was arrogant and I assumed that I knew everything and I assumed that the faith of my grandmother was based on superstition. I was very arrogant about what I thought I knew.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it again for the Vice President of the United States.
Thank you.
And thank you, Robert. Mr. Vice President, welcome to the Nixon Library. It is an honor to have you here. Communion, Finding My Way Back to Faith is your second book, and it has reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, so congratulations.
Thank you. A few weeks ago, some reporter asked me what was the difference between me and Gavin Newsom as political figures, and one of the things I can now say is that people actually bought my book and not his.
Well, and your book is incredibly candid. It's very introspective, and it is largely devoid of politics. Instead, you focus on faith, and there are a few things more personal than someone's faith. You take us through the arc of losing and rediscovering your faith. So let's jump into it. You talk about the beginnings of your crisis of faith in the earliest pages of this book. There are a few seminal moments when you were a boy, your faith was shaken, most notably involving your grandmother, who you write, quote, hardly fits the stereotype of a sweater-knitting, kindly old grandmother. She loved to say the F word, and when she died, she owned 19 loaded handguns.
Correct.
But she lost her health care, and then her ultimate passing helped lead you to a crisis. Let's start there. Talk about that.
Sure. So, my grandmother was in many ways not a stereotypical grandmother. And, she did have 19 loaded handguns when she died. And I remember when my aunt and I and my sister were going through her things after she had passed away, we would find loaded revolvers all around the house, in like the knife drawer and in her dresser and her wardrobe, and we sort of were trying to think about why she had guns stashed everywhere, and we realized it was because Mamaw was a particularly, well, let's just say she believed in the Second Amendment, and she believed in the right of self-defense, and so she didn't get around that well towards the end of her life, and so she made sure that no matter where she was, if somebody walked in her door, she would have a loaded revolver within arm's reach. And that was the kind of woman that she was. And she cussed a lot. I mean, there are so many stories I could tell about the ways in which her language was passed on to me. And my wife, who grew up in a very middle-class Southern California family, there are times where she'll be like, you can't say those things around our 9-year-old, our 6-year-old, our 4-year-old, because they repeat them. Like, for example, I'll tell you a story that one of the earliest flights that I had after I got elected to the Senate, I was flying back from Cincinnati to DC, and because my kids were so young at the time, like sometimes I would just take a kid with me and hang out with me in DC, and that was one of the ways I made sure that I stayed connected to my kids. We eventually moved the whole family to Washington, but for those first 6 months, I would only see my kids on weekends, and so I'd bring them to DC. And I remember I was on a plane on a Delta flight from CVG to Washington Reagan Airport, and my son drops one of those Delta Biscoff cookies between his seat, and he looks at me and he goes, well, shit. And I like had this moment of sort of panic because I realized everybody around, think about it, a flight from Cincinnati to DC, literally every person knows that I'm a United States Senator, and also that I've apparently a terrible father because I've raised my kids, my 3-year-old, to use that language. But anyway, that's the weave. We'll get back to the question. But here's, the thing is, despite the fact that she was very non-conventional in a lot of ways, my grandmother was a person of very deep religious faith. And so when she died, I'll never forget this, and I still get a little bit emotional when I think about it. She had this practice where she had a little notebook, and she would say prayers and write her prayers down when she said them for each member of her family. And so you could actually see this almost as a diary of her conversations with God through the months or even through the years where, she'd pray for my safety, or she'd pray for my strength, or she'd pray, that something would go right in my sister's life. And you just realize that this was a woman who was constantly talking to God, despite the fact that her religion is what you might call unchurched. She loved the Lord. She believed in Jesus Christ. She also didn't go to church that often. And looking back, I think one of the things that I realized about my own faith is that I was attached to Christianity via my grandmother. She was the anchor. She was the person who taught me about God. She was the person who constantly was encouraging me to think about God. She was the person who was encouraging me to read the Bible and to pray. And because I didn't have a great church community myself, I would bounce around to various churches. Sometimes we'd go once a month, sometimes less than that. When my grandmother died, just a couple of months before I left for Iraq in 2005, I sort of lost my faith. And I think there was a sort of lesson in there for me, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I came back to my faith. And part of the thing I was trying to think through with this book is, why is it that kids who are raised in the faith fall away from it? I think most of us in this audience are probably people of faith. We raise our children to be Christians. I take my kids to church every Sunday, even when they're misbehaving and they don't want to go. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm writing this book, what makes it take and what makes it not take? Why do some kids who are raised in the faith have this very, very strong connection to Christ, whereas some kids, it just doesn't ever really take root? And that's one of the things I was trying to think of. And one of the answers I came up with myself is, while it's very important to have a parent or a grandparent or somebody who raises you in your faith, I think that if that's it, if your only connection to faith is a loved one rather than something deeper and broader, then your faith is always going to be at risk, like mine was when that person passes away. And so that is definitely one of the things that I write about, and one of the things that motivated me to write the book in the first place.
Well, and that's kind of where this debate, which you write about, between reason and science, right? And then versus the mystery of faith. And you say that this is playing out on Reddit threads, and we've all heard those theological debates, and you're having these debates with yourself.
Sure.
So you then begin classifying yourself as an atheist. And you write, quote, "I was severing myself from my roots." How and why did that happen?
Yeah, so, I grew up in a working class family in southwestern Ohio, and to lose my faith when I was, 21 years old, 22 years old, so I'm in the Marine Corps, I go to Iraq. By the time that I leave the Marines, this would have been 2007, I was now calling myself an atheist. And to do that was, it was this very sad thing in some ways, because I was disconnecting myself from the family that made me who I was, right? To sort of say that I wasn't